Remember, we've said that climate is an aggregate of the weather in any given region. Climate involves the exchanges of energy and moisture that are occurring in the atmosphere, between the atmosphere and the hydrosphere, and between the atmosphere, the solid earth, the biosphere, and the cryosphere, which includes ice and snow. Every location has a distinctive climate, but some types of climate are found in many parts of the planet. The most important elements in the climatic description are temperature and precipitation. We classify climates so that we can compare different regions and understand how climate change is going to affect different regions. Climate classification brings a large quantity of information together and puts it in some kind of order. There have been a lot of different climate classification systems devised, but the one that is most widely used around the planet is called the Köppen classification of climates. This is the best known and most used system, and it uses the mean monthly and annual values of temperature and precipitation to describe a climate. The Köppen classification of climates divides the world into climatic regions in a very realistic way based on observations that you or I could make on a daily basis. The boundaries that Köppen chose were based largely on the limits of certain types of plants. The plants that you find in a given climate are controlled by temperature and precipitation. There are actually 5 principal climate groups. We have the humid subtropics. These are areas where the sun angle is going to be very high at all seasons of the year. We have dry climates that are going to have low precipitation throughout the year. We have humid middle latitude climates above the tropics. These climates have mild winters. We have the humid mid-latitude with severe winters, or D-type climates, and the polar climates. A, C, and D-type climates are defined based on temperature characteristics, but precipitation is the primary criterion for identifying a B-type climate, the dry climates. When we look at a map of the climate of the world based on the Köppen classification, we see latitudinal zones. The equator is running through the northern part of South America and through Central Africa, and we see that in this region we have a couple of climates that have the word wet associated with them. This is because these are areas that have a high level of rainfall either every month of the year or at least several months out of the year. So we have the wet tropics shown in the darkest shade of orange, and the tropical wet and dry climate shown in the lighter shade of orange. The tropical wet and dry climate is the area in which the seasonal changes occur from summer to winter, and you get a wet season associated with one part of the year and a dry season associated with the other. The dry climates are shown in yellow and tan. These are regions that have low rainfall throughout the year, and they have very warm conditions. The humid mid-latitude climates are shown in shades of green, and these are areas that are north and south of the tropics. As you go closer to the poles in the northern hemisphere, you begin to see blue shades, and these are the continental climates that are associated with being relatively far from the ocean, shown in blue. And finally, as you get closer to the northern pole, we have the subarctic climate shown in purple. And then the polar climates, where you have periods of time where the sun never comes above the horizon and the temperatures are very, very cold. In addition, we have something called highland climates, and these are climates in which altitude is causing a cooling and also in many cases a change in precipitation. When we look at the eastern hemisphere, we see similar latitudinal zonations, with places like Australia being predominantly a desert type of climate, but as you get closer to the equator, the continent of Australia actually nudges into the tropics and does have some very tropical wet and dry climates. Closer to the equator, we have almost completely the wet tropics, accompanying highland climates on some of the islands that have very high volcanic mountain ranges. The humid tropical climates, or type A climates, are essentially winterless climates. The mean temperature is always above 18 degrees centigrade. In the wet tropics, you have high temperatures year-round. This is the land of the tropical rainforest, and it's found in many parts of the planet. It rains a lot all year. It's warm all year. And this is in a sort of discontinuous belt that is essentially astride the equator. This is an area that is influenced by equatorial low pressures, and you have consistently warm, rising conditions in the air. The tropical wet and dry climate has seasonal rainfall, and when the rays of the sun are more direct is typically the season in which rainfall increases. Then as the earth moves in its revolution around the sun, during the winter season you'll typically have less rainfall. We can actually look at climagraphs shown in this slide and see temperature shown in the red line is staying fairly even throughout the year. In the diagram on the left, which is in Peru, this is the wet all year version of this type of climate, very high levels of rainfall all year. The central and the diagram on the right are showing the wet, dry tropical type of climate. In the northern hemisphere, in Liberia, it is wet during the summertime in the northern hemisphere, and then it's wet in the summertime in the southern hemisphere and dry during what would be their winter time on the last climograph in this slide. The B climates, or dry climates, are places where evaporation exceeds precipitation. This means that the atmosphere is typically fairly dry, the land surface is fairly dry, and there's very little precipitation. So there's a constant water deficiency. Animals and plants both have had to evolve specific ways to deal with this constant water deficiency. And when humans move into an environment like this, typically we have to irrigate because there's not enough rainfall to support agriculture. There are three variables that are determining the boundaries between the different kinds of climates. And so for type B climates, we have average annual precipitation, the average annual temperature, and the seasonal distribution of precipitation. We have the arid or desert climates, which are exceedingly dry and have very low levels of rainfall, and then the semi-arid or steppe environments, which typically surround the arid regions. These are more humid, and these are areas that are very well inhabited by people who primarily graze animals in this type of environment. The grazing of animals, however, can destroy the vegetation, and once the vegetation is destroyed, the humidity actually drops because vegetation will pull moisture from the soil and put it into the atmosphere. When the humidity drops, the small amount of rainfall they were getting diminishes, so these semi-arid regions are being desertified or turned into deserts by grazing activities. This is being caused by grazing in places like North Africa, northern Mexico, and the southwestern United States. In the low latitudes, for example, in North Africa, which is about 30 degrees north, in northwestern India, northern Mexico, and the southwestern part of the United States, these areas are under a steady atmospheric circulation pattern that brings dry, subsiding air. These are called the subtropical high pressure belts. So these areas are doomed to be deserts because of this constant location of subsiding dry air. Makes it very difficult to form clouds, and there's very little chance of rainfall at any time of the year. That's one reason that we have deserts and steppe environments. If we look at a map of the arid and semi-arid climates around the world, they're shown here in yellow and gray, with the steppes surrounding the arid regions. We see that this type of subsiding high-pressure cell occurs over the Sahara Desert, it occurs over the Kalahari Desert, and it occurs over the Simpson and Great Sandy Deserts in Australia. All of these regions are deserts because of sustained atmospheric circulation patterns. If we look in Asia and the western part of the United States, we see deserts there as well. These deserts are actually there because large mountain ranges block these regions from water that could circulate in from the oceans. So the mid-latitude deserts and steppes are there due to their position either very deep in the interior of a large landmass or where they are blocked from moisture coming off the ocean by the presence of high mountains. Most of these types of deserts are located in the northern hemisphere. We can look at these types of climates and see the tiny little blue bars on the graphs are indicating the amount of rainfall. Monterrey, Mexico would be more of a steppe-like climate, but the outer graphs for Lovelock, Nevada and Cairo, Egypt, these are areas that have very low levels of rainfall throughout the year. The mid-latitude climates are some of the climates that are the most widely populated, and they're also very popular because they're excellent for agriculture. The average temperature in the coldest month of the year in this type of climate is below 18 degrees centigrade, but above minus 3 degrees centigrade. So it's not terribly cold, and it warms up in the summer. These are typically located on the eastern sides of continents, above 25 degrees and below 40 degrees in latitude. These areas typically have mild winters, hot, humid, sultry summers, and if they get precipitation in the winter, it's because cold fronts are moving through the region. So we can see these climates shown in the light green on this map in the southeastern part of the United States. This is the common kind of climate. We also have humid mid-latitude climates with mild winters, and one of the subgroups in this type of climate occurs along the western coast of continents between 40 and 65 degrees north. There is a steady onshore flow of ocean air. Because they're close to the ocean, these places have mild winters and cool summers, and they typically have a lot of rainfall. We even have what are classified as rainforests in these areas. So an example of this would be the type of climate around Seattle, Washington, would be the marine West Coast climate. And there can be a lot of humidity in the air because they're close to the ocean. Very misty, fog is quite common in this type of climate. So you can see this along the western coast of North America in the darker green color. It also occurs in Europe, in the countries like France and Germany and Great Britain. And it's found along the coast of South America on the western side of the continent. Another type of climate that we're going to see here is going to occur a little bit closer to the equator, but still close to the coastline. And this is called the Mediterranean climate. It was first described actually around the Mediterranean Ocean. It's still a humid mid-latitude climate with mild winter, but these types of climates are dry in the summer. This has a big impact on agriculture because typically if it's summertime you want to grow crops, and that's when you'd like to have rainfall. That means that the type of agriculture that's suited to this type of climate would typically be something that involved growing grapes or having orchards and growing things like olives and almonds. And these types of crops don't have to be irrigated in this type of climate. This is one of the most popular climates to live in because it's very, very pleasant. So this is showing the range of different types of climates. You can see that there is a greater temperature range at these latitudes, and the variations in rainfall are seasonal, but there is rainfall throughout the year. As we go farther to the north in the northern hemisphere, we get into the humid middle latitude climates with severe winters, or the D-type climates, and there are several versions of the D-type climates. The average temperature of the coldest months is below -3 degrees centigrade, and the warmest monthly mean exceeds 10 degrees centigrade. These are climates that are called land-controlled climates because they're far away from the influence of the ocean. They're going to be more severe climates with more dramatic changes in temperature, and they're typically going to have a lot of snowfall. These climates are absent in the southern hemisphere because we don't have large continental land masses at these latitudes in the southern hemisphere. The humid continental climate is found in the central and eastern portions of North America and in Eurasia above 40 and below 50 degrees north latitude. These have very severe winters, and they also have hot summers, so there's a huge annual temperature range. The precipitation's generally the greatest in the summer, with more snowfall but not the same amount of precipitation in the winter. And snow typically remains on the ground for extended periods of time. The subarctic climate is even farther north, and it's often referred to as the taiga climate. In this type of climate, we find the largest continuous forests left on Earth, although these are being logged now in both Canada and in Siberia. These are where continental polar air masses are most common, and these are very dry, cold air masses. You get extremely cold winters, but you have a short but remarkably warm summer because the sun is in the sky for 20 hours a day at some times. So you do warm up actually quite a bit in the summer. This is a picture of what's called the boreal forest on the taiga. These look like majestic towering trees, but in general these trees are maybe 2 or 3 stories tall. But they do form the largest continuous forest cover on the planet that remains. These climates, as you go farther north, get more and more severe. In the slide on the left, we see that we're at about 42 degrees north. You've got an extreme temperature range from the coldest part of the year to the warmest part of the year. And there is precipitation throughout the year, but it's not a heavy amount of precipitation. The part of the slide on the right, we're at 51 degrees north, and you see the temperature range is even more extreme, and overall the temperatures are lower. The precipitation is lower as well. But these types of climate do sustain very large forests. By the time we get to the polar climates, the mean temperature of the warmest month is below 10 degrees centigrade. It's cold basically all the time, and there's actually not a lot of precipitation because cold air won't hold very much water vapor. It's hard to get precipitation out of that cold, dry air. The tundra climate is essentially treeless, and that's largely because there's not much precipitation. This type of climate is found almost exclusively in the northern hemisphere. It has cool summers and very cold winters, and a very high annual temperature range. The ice cap climate, this would be on Greenland or the Antarctic. There's permanent ice and snow, and no monthly mean is above 0 degrees centigrade. This would be the tundra type of climate. It's treeless, but there's actually quite a bit of plant cover. Because it's so cold, the biological resources are constrained by that cold temperature, so you don't have a lot of species diversity here. And part of that has to do with temperature, part of it has to do with low rainfall. You can see that the temperatures are sliding farther and farther down these graphs. The temperature ranges are more extreme, and by the time you get into the Greenland area, it's not actually showing measurable precipitation throughout the year. So you can see these are very dry climates. Highland climates are found and controlled by altitude. They're usually cooler and wetter than the adjacent lowlands because as you raise air from the lowlands to higher levels and cool it off, you get condensation, cloud formation, and precipitation. These highland type of climates can have a great diversity of conditions, and they can change over the short term quite a bit. So we're seeing some of the changes associated with climate warming are impacting the highland climates the most because these are highly changeable types of environments. On the top graph, we are seeing temperatures in Phoenix, Arizona. We see a great temperature range, but a relatively high temperature in the summer, and it doesn't get terribly cold during the winter. In Flagstaff, Arizona, though, we're seeing lower temperatures throughout the year, a very similar temperature range, but we're getting much more precipitation at this higher level. And both of these at a very similar latitude, but the highland climate has more precipitation than the lowland area. Humans are having a noticeable impact on the global climate, but humans have been modifying the environment over large geographic areas for thousands of years. Generally, when humans first would come into a new geographic region, they would bring with them hunting methods that involve the use of fire. So many continents, when they first saw human occupation, were burned off. The vegetation cover was drastically changed. So when the Aboriginal people went into Australia around 50,000 years ago, they introduced fire, and they completely changed the land cover, which changed the climate dramatically. When we colonized the northern hemisphere, what we did in North America was to cut down trees beginning about 200 years ago and institute agriculture. And by cutting down the trees, we changed the climate of the entire planet. We also have a tendency to bring grazing animals with us and overgraze marginal lands and perhaps turn them into deserts. So we can look at past climate change over several thousand years that has been caused by humans. We've been impacting the climate in one way or another for at least 50,000 years. We are impacting the climate now. The ways in which we're impacting the climate and the rates at which that impact is occurring are to some degree controversial. The models that are designed to explain what has happened and what's going to happen have not converged. We don't have a totally new paradigm that explains climate change at this point in our studies. Global warming is something that we hear about. We know about the greenhouse effect and the fact that water vapor and carbon dioxide absorb heat and are responsible for the greenhouse effect. We love the greenhouse effect. We don't want it to go away. But by burning fossil fuels, we are adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and it appears to be having an impact on warming the climate. The climate, though, has been warming for at least 10,000 years. The effects of burning fossil fuel are probably accentuating the rise in global temperatures, but they are almost certainly not causing the climate warming because the climate warming has been going on for at least 10,000 years. And these cycles of warming and cooling in the climate have also been going on for hundreds of thousands of years as we study the past. How are we adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere? We're adding it by generating electricity. Electrical plants typically burn coal or some sort of oil, and in that process they release carbon dioxide. As we heat and cool our homes, we use that electricity, and more carbon dioxide is put into the atmosphere during our summer because we turn on our air conditioners. Our trash in landfills gives off carbon dioxide as it decomposes. Our cars release carbon dioxide in their exhaust, and airplanes release carbon dioxide. So there is a noticeably higher level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere now than prior to the Industrial Revolution that began a couple of hundred years ago when we started burning large amounts of fossil fuels. So we can look at the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we can look at CO2 emissions going back into the 19th century as the Industrial Revolution kicked off and we burned more fossil fuels. CO2 emissions went up, and the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide has also gone up. But carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has changed in a cycle over the past 400,000 years. When carbon dioxide levels are high in the atmosphere is warm and the glaciers retreat. When carbon dioxide levels drop, the atmosphere cools and glacial ice advances. It has advanced several times over the past 400,000 years. The most recent glacial age ended about 20,000 years ago, and the climate has been warming noticeably for at least 10,000 years. We appear to be adding to that warming to some extent. So as global temperatures increase, we see that there is evidence that humans are influencing global climate again, as we have done in the past. This time it's by burning fossil fuels. In the past, it's been by burning forests. It's projected by models that have been developed by atmospheric scientists that the global average surface temperature is going to increase somewhere between 1.4 to 5.8 degrees centigrade by the year 2100. This is not a very precise prediction. Different models predict different amounts of warming. In addition to carbon dioxide, there are other gases that we are putting into the atmosphere that also absorb heat. Methane, nitrous oxide, and chlorofluorocarbons are all greenhouse gases, just like carbon dioxide. In fact, methane is a much more effective greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. As we graze more animals because people want to eat more meat, these animals are releasing large amounts of methane into the atmosphere and also contributing to the enhanced effect of the greenhouse effect. All of these gases are absorbing wavelengths that are being radiated from the surface of the Earth after the Earth's surface has been warmed up by the sun. And these trace gases, the methane and chlorofluorocarbons, the nitrous oxides, may be even more important in the future than carbon dioxide. Now they're at least as great as carbon dioxide. So we've talked about positive feedback mechanisms and negative feedback mechanisms. So scientists, when they look at alterations to the climate system, have to consider both of these types of feedback mechanisms to see if what we're doing is going to either reinforce the initial change or if it's going to decrease the change. With the positive feedback that reinforces the initial change, an example would be melting sea ice off of the Arctic Ocean. When there's sea ice on the Arctic Ocean, its greatest extent is in the wintertime, and it begins to melt in the summer. If more ice melts in the summer, more open ocean is exposed, and that open ocean, instead of reflecting light back into the atmosphere, absorbs and then re-releases heat into the atmosphere. So that heats the atmosphere even more. So heating the atmosphere results in more heating of the atmosphere. With the negative feedback mechanism, though, there's more evaporation off the surface of the ocean because it's warmer. And this increases water vapor in the atmosphere and allows for increased cloud formation. Clouds block the sun, so the ocean cools because less sunlight is coming through the clouds. So both of these type of mechanisms are acting on the planet now, and there are many other feedback mechanisms associated with global warming that are not yet well understood. But global warming is happening. It was happening before the Industrial Revolution, and it's not going to stop. So we have to determine how much we're contributing to it, and we also have to prepare for a future that will be warmer no matter what we do. What we have to look forward to is an altered distribution of the world's water resources. It's going to affect the hydrologic cycle. This is going to affect the productivity of many agricultural regions. Some regions will get more rainfall, and they will also be warmer, and they'll be able to grow crops they couldn't grow before. Some regions will get less rainfall, and their agriculture may be damaged very badly. As ice melts off of the land of Greenland and off of the Antarctic, that water goes into the ocean and is raising sea level. 80% of human population lives within about 100 kilometers of the oceans. So this could have a very dramatic effect on human populations and cause big migrations. We may have a higher frequency and intensity of hurricanes, although this isn't actually happening yet. But that would be because we would have hotter oceans and hurricanes form over hot spots in the ocean. Large-scale cyclonic storms that are active in the northern hemisphere and bring us snowfall and rainfall at different seasons may change their path, altering precipitation patterns again, and could affect agriculture or increase flooding. And we may have more heat waves, stronger cold snaps, and droughts. So this is something not necessarily to look forward to, but to prepare for. When we look at trying to cut back on our contributions of carbon dioxide, we see that a large amount of energy consumption in the United States does come from fossil fuels, and when we burn those, we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. This is a graph from 2004, but over the past several years, these percentages have not changed dramatically. We still get the vast amount of our energy consumption through the burning of fossil fuels. When we look at the renewable energy slice of the pie, in the smaller graph on the right, we see that in 2004, most of the biomass that we're talking about providing for energy for us to consume came from biomass. A tiny part came from solar energy. Quite a bit came from hydroelectric power, so this would be dams. A very small percentage came from wind, and a very small percentage came from geothermal. All of these areas of renewable energy will expand in the future, but there are many technological problems associated with renewable energy. For example, wind generators are being put up that are not actually connected effectively to the power grid. So they have the capacity to generate energy for us to consume with wind, but they don't have the capacity to transmit it from one spot to another. And putting in the transmission infrastructure is going to be very expensive. Solar power is also growing, but there are problems with solar power that involve the technology, the expense of the technology as well as the efficiency of the technology. All of these areas of renewable energy are undergoing massive research projects both by industry and by government. And in the future, renewable energy will become more important. But it could be decades until renewable energy replaces or even becomes equal to the amount of energy that we consume based on fossil fuels.